conundrum that Panasonic found itself with the GH6 is something that I do not envy, because how do you take a camera like the GH5? We're talking a camera that was doing 4K 60 before TikTokers even knew how to walk. How do you make a camera that everybody almost unanimously sees as the king of mirrorless cameras, probably until the last couple of years when everything got better than the GH5, but you have all this time to make the beast even beastier, and I don't know if the GH6 is what the GH5 was when it came out. I've only had this camera for a very short period of time, and so this is just going to be first impressions, some thoughts, a rant. Be that as it may, let's talk all about the Lumix GH6. A little bit of context. Look, I've been shooting Micro Four Thirds ever since the Lumix G7. I also had a GH4, and the GH5 was probably my main freelance video camera for at least 5 years of my freelance videography and commercial photography career. And so for me, I love Micro Four Thirds. I even have a Blackmagic Pocket 4K, which is Micro Four Thirds. But then here's what happened. Full frame cameras got better. They got cheaper. They got smaller. They got specs that only those sort of smaller Micro Four Thirds sensors had. And what really made things complicated was the Lumix S5, because for all intents and purposes, in my opinion, the Lumix S5 is the GH6 that I've always wanted. And maybe this is a spoiler alert, but I still think that's the case. In fact, I still think even the GH5 is probably a better bang for your buck than the GH6, but we'll get into all of that in a second. I just want to give you a little bit of my own bias towards this system. I love Panasonic. I obviously have a Sony now as well because I need autofocus, and again, that's something we're definitely going to talk about in this video too. I am shooting this video with the GH6, and so you can be a judge of the video quality all throughout this video as you're actually watching it, as well as the autofocus. I'm totally throwing caution to the wind here. I don't know if I'm in focus right now. This thing's a little bit like 6 feet away from me, and I have no idea if the box is actually on me. And if the box is on me, I still don't know if I'm actually in focus. But otherwise, look, I like Micro Four Thirds, and I have been a big fan of it, and I invested a lot of money in Micro Four Thirds too. But now that the Lumix S5 exists, even the S1, S1H, and all the great cameras from Canon, Sony, and even Nikon, I personally have a hard time selling Micro Four Thirds anymore. And so this camera has big shoes to fill for me, because it's not only trying to fill the shoes of what the GH5 did, but also has to fill the shoes of what the Lumix S5 does, and to an extent even my Sony A7 IV. On paper, this camera is an absolute spec monster. This is doing every codec and resolution at unlimited recording times infinitely. Like, the amount of things that this camera can do internally is absolutely insane, including ProRes. There's very few cameras that shoot ProRes internally, particularly in a hybrid mirrorless camera like this GH6. But here's where things, I don't know, maybe this will get a little controversial, but on paper that's really cool. You're like, oh, awesome, this thing can shoot ProRes. That's awesome. I love ProRes. It runs so smooth on my computer. Okay, cool. But the file sizes are massive. This thing will do 422 and also 422 HQ. We're talking huge freaking file sizes. We talk about ProRes with the iPhone, which I thought was a complete joke. Yeah, it makes more sense in a real dedicated camera, for sure. But I'm much more inclined to shoot, MP4 or H.265 with this camera just to save data rates. And the quality is so substantially great that really that little bump that you're getting from ProRes, it's cool, but I really don't think there's a trade-off for size versus quality that makes sense to me. And even consider like one of the flagship features that they're touting for this camera, which is 4K 60 unlimited recording in 10-bit 422. Cool, but you can do that with an A7S III. You can technically do that even with an A7 IV. Even the Lumix S5, even though it caps out at 30-minute clips, you could go as long as you wanted to in 4K 60. The thing's not going to overheat. So that's cool on paper, but is it really a standout feature for the GH6? Like, honestly, the fact that it does 4K 60 and 10-bit is cool, because the GH5 only did it in 8-bit. Like, that's fine, but we moved on. We've moved on from the GH5. There's a whole lot of cameras that have filled the gaps that were missing on the GH5 leading up to this GH6, and this is like the overarching thesis of this camera. I really don't think it competes with the cameras of today at this price bracket. $2,200 is a steep price tag for this camera, in my opinion, because if you consider the price of the Lumix S5, which I've heard people saying they get it for $1,400-1,500, I think even retail is only like $1,800-1,900. So the fact that the S5 is cheaper than the GH6 is really bizarre to me. I know if you get down to the paper specs, you will say that the GH6 is a lot better, but I'm talking real world situations here. We're not looking at the B&H photo page. We're talking about having this camera in hand and actually using it. I'm going S5. I'm even still going GH5. Like, buy a used GH5. That to me is the better move here than grabbing the GH6. At least my thoughts right now. And that brings us to today's sponsor. This is such a segue. What a segue we're doing right now, because we're going to talk all about buying and selling your used or new filmmaking equipment on GearFocus.com. GearFocus is a one-stop shop for filmmakers, photographers, editors, and more to buy and sell new, vintage, and used gear. GearFocus gives creators a seamless experience with two-way communication as well as buyer and seller transaction protection that screens and monitors all postings and transactions. No more sketchy parking lot meetups to sell your old camera, and no more flaky sellers that won't respond to your messages. So if you're looking for cameras, lenses, lights, drones, and more, check out GearFocus.com to score a deal or sell your equipment safely and securely to help fund that new purchase as well. Thank you again to GearFocus for sponsoring this video. You know, it kind of feels like the GH6 is this really hyper niche, dedicated video camera for people that shoot weddings, that do a lot of corporate work, maybe some run and gun documentary stuff here and there. It's a very specialized camera, even though it technically does everything. But the fact that it's micro four thirds, which means you're kind of locked into a 2x crop, unless you go into speed boosters and all that stuff that I'm really not that interested anymore. I like going from glass directly to the camera and having nothing in between. You're at a 2x crop here with, you know, a beast of a video camera, don't get me wrong. But really, is that enough? That's really what I'm wrestling with this camera. And of course I need to spend more time with it, but this is just sort of my first thought as I've played with it and as I've used it. I'm like, it really just feels like a GH5 with a few more bells and whistles. But I also kind of felt that with the GH5 2 that came out, which now seems like even a stranger camera than I thought it was when it first came out. Like, look, we take the IBIS from the GH5 and we add a few more stops. So now we're at 7.5 stops of IBIS with the GH6. Is that awesome? Absolutely. Have I had issues with the IBIS on the Lumix S5? No. Then we get to the massive elephant in the room, which is autofocus. Is this the best autofocus that Panasonic has put in a camera? Yes, but it could also be considered the worst autofocus system any other camera manufacturer would have put out this year. We're still using a DFD system. We have not gone to phase detect, and this is just like, are you kidding me? It's really probably all we ever really needed for the GH6. You could have took a GH5 and maybe added 10-bit 4K 60 and added phase detect, and I would have been like, sure, that's it. That's the camera. I'll buy it. Sign me up. Now, I don't want it to seem like I'm shitting all over this camera. There's a lot of stuff to love about this camera because in general, every camera now is so damn great that all the little nitpicky things and the stuff that I'm pissed off about, it's entirely subjective. There's a lot of stuff here that I'm saying that might not even pertain to you. You could love absolutely everything about this camera because it is a fantastic, wonderful camera, because they've taken the GH5 and they've added a whole bunch of stuff to it that makes it even better. So how could you even make a bad camera out of a GH5, because the GH5 was already so great? So what do? You add a couple more record buttons, you add better IBIS, you kind of improve the autofocus system so that, you know, some of those diehard Panasonic fans can be like, hey, it is better now and it works in 60 frames per second. So sure, they're going to be super happy. That's great. Nobody cares. Honestly, nobody cares. It's okay to like or dislike this camera. All I'm saying is, for me, in my personal use case scenario, a lot of the stuff in this camera is just not useful to me. It's cool, ProRes, all that, fascinating, awesome, great IBIS. Still picking up my Lumix S5. Give me full frame. Don't give me 2x crops anymore. I don't want to deal with it. I don't want a speed boost. That's me. That's totally me. You might be fine with speed boosting. There's a really great case to be made about micro four thirds and the infinite amount of lenses that you can put on this camera. That ship has sailed for me. It doesn't really matter. Give me a 24-70 on a Lumix S5 or a Sony A7 IV, and I'm smooth sailing and I'm ready to go. Totally what bothers me is that, like, the GH5 for me was just the ultimate run and gun camera for client work. I've shot little commercials with that camera before. I've shot weddings with it. I've shot documentaries. I've shot everything with that camera. But ultimately, now that you get a taste of really good autofocus, and you're like, why would I buy a camera that doesn't have this anymore? I'd rather deal with all the other crap in a Sony A7 IV than deal with crappy autofocus on the GH6. So that's me. You might be totally different. So look, I'm going to spend a little bit more time with this camera, see if all of my hesitations and I guess I'm cautiously optimistic this thing could still blow me away at some point, but you know, image quality wise, even the stuff that I've seen so far, I would probably still give that to the Lumix S5. Something I want to explore in a future video probably too is where does this camera live next to something like a Blackmagic Pocket 4K, because then I could see a whole argument to be made that I would rather have the GH6 than a Pocket 4K. It's a better camera, better ergonomics, better screen, internal cooling, just everything you'd probably want in a camera on the sort of like cinema front from what the Pocket 4K is trying to do. But I don't know. We got to see how that kind of flies too. I just don't know if that's worth it anymore, again, with the Lumix S5, but I'll give it the benefit of the doubt and we'll see. I'll test it out and try it. I think I want to do like a little short film with this camera and really put it through its paces. But ultimately, look, the GH6 is here. I'm iffy on it. It's cool. There's a lot of fun stuff about it. The new screen, the tilt up, the tilt out, all that stuff is cool. All the, you know, ergonomics of it are really nice, and you know, it's fine. Are we spoiled now? Absolutely. There's just way too many good cameras out right now that you couldn't make a bad choice. I don't think you'd be upset if you got the GH6. I just think there's better options out still, particularly at that price point, especially if you look at the Lumix S5 or if you look at an older GH5 even, or pretty much anything from Sony. I'm just not sure this is ticking all the boxes for me at this moment in time. If you have any questions about the GH6, please let me know in the comments. Otherwise, you will see or hear me next time I feel like making a video. There's a bus. I don't know if you can hear it. I don't even know how the audio was in this video. If it's shit, I'm definitely not re-recording it. So you've probably been dealing with whatever happened throughout this video. It was either really good or really bad. I don't know at this particular moment in time. I'm going to keep rambling. How do you like the 90s vibes? I got a whole 90s photo shoot session video coming up very soon that is one of my favorite videos I've done in a very long time, and it has nothing to do with the GH6, so I don't know what I'm talking about it here. Okay, bye-bye. See you later. Oh, that's kind of cool, actually. Thumbnail. Makes no sense because the camera's not in it, and people just want to watch the camera. They don't want to see my face, and whatever. Goodbye.